Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining the webinar today. My name is Chris Antlitz. I'm a principal analyst in the telecom practice at TBR. Today, we're going to be talking about the 5G market. Specifically, we're going to be sharing some insights from our recently published 5G Telecom Market Landscape and 5G Telecom Market Forecast reports. Let me just go through some housekeeping items before we get started. At the bottom of your screens, you're going to see a series of buttons. From left to right, you can access the slides, audio controls, Q&A, speaker bios, and the survey. After the webinar, you're going to receive an email with a reply link, as well as a link to view and register for other TBR webinars. If you have any questions for us, please submit them via the Q&A widget on this platform. You can also reach out to us after the event at webinars@tbri.com, or you can email me directly. My email will be on the Q&A slide. And thanks again for joining us, and we're going to get started. That's me. Picture of me. My email address is there. You're going to see that again. Again, if you want to reach out to me after, feel free to reach out via that email address. Before we jump into the content, I want to talk about our research coverage at TBR. This is our syndicated coverage in the telecom group. TBR covers all sectors of the ICT ecosystem. I represent the telecom space within that umbrella. These are the reports that we write. It varies from telecom vendors, telecom operators, individual companies. We also have market level coverage for the 5G market, which we're going to be talking about today. We also cover the NFV-SDN market, so the network transformation, digitalization of the telco and the new network architecture. That's where we talk about those items. In the private cellular networks reports, we talk about enterprise spend on cellular networks. And we also have edge computing reports as well as coverage on the web scales. We typically will do review webinars every few months on one of those reports. And we also have custom work. So this is our syndicated reports. We also do a significant amount of custom research, range of financial modeling. We do consulting, business decision validation, spanning a whole range of topics. Okay, so with that, let's jump into the content. So this year has been a very good year for the 5G market. And in the last 6 months, we've seen some significant catalysts emerge that are concurrently fueling an acceleration in the 5G market. This acceleration is unparalleled. We've never seen something like this before with prior cellular generations. And one of the key accelerants of this is governments are getting involved. This is what we're going to be talking about today. What does that look like? What is going on? How much money are we talking? How is that manifesting itself? And what does this mean for the telecom industry and more broadly, the global economy going forward? I think everybody's going to find this incredibly interesting. So obviously we've had COVID-19 enter the picture. That has brought a push for accelerating digital transformation. Companies are facing a challenge on how do they align with the new normal. So we see that manifesting in different ways in different industries. Some industries getting hit worse than others, but the common denominator is everybody is looking at digital transformation. across industries, and the amount of interest has gone way up since COVID-19 entered the picture. Bridging the digital divide is another big, something else that's brought a lot more pressure into the world stage. So, for example, in the States, there's still well over 10 million households in the States that are underserved or unserved with internet connectivity. And as we're looking at things like teleeducation and telehealth, that digital divide is creating, that's creating big issues. And the governments are looking at that and saying, well, we need to bridge that once and for all. We're going to talk about some programs that have come into the market that are looking to address that once and for all in specific countries. There's still a few billion people in the world that are underserved or unserved with internet connectivity. We expect in this new normal and with this unprecedented government involvement that number is going to dramatically fall over this decade. Geopolitics is a secondary but increasingly increasing consideration here for driving the 5G market. So we have a tech race going on. We have national security being implicated here, and governments are under pressure to keep pace and provide market support. So it's not only for national security, it's also for economic competitiveness reasons. And I think COVID-19 and the impact, the fallout of that has exposed vulnerabilities in the global economy that need to get addressed. And 5G is rising to the occasion and is going to be one of many responses to mitigating these issues. We're going to talk more about that in upcoming slides, so let's put a pin in that for now. And thirdly, CSP Business Realities. So we all know data traffic's growing, cost per bit needs to come down. Telcos need to add capacity in a cost-optimal way. They need agility, and they need to capitalize on new market opportunities. The net of this is governments worldwide are getting either directly or indirectly involved in ensuring 5G is widely deployed in their respective countries. And this spend, we're seeing more and more examples of 5G-related spend getting tied to economic recovery packages, and the spend for this public funding is being justified on economic, national security, and public health grounds. So this slide is the boilerplate, if you will, for what we're going to talk about now in depth in the upcoming slides. So basically, the last 6 months, we've seen a huge acceleration in 5G timetables. And these are the three underlying reasons that are fueling that acceleration. Okay, so let's put some numbers to that. So what you're seeing here is our market size for 5G. This is CSP CapEx spend on 5G. That's what you're seeing here specifically. Pre-COVID and an adjustment after we've seen what this new normal might look like. So I want to walk everybody through what's changed and how this market is getting accelerated. So back in January 23rd of 2020, we came out with our, at the time, that was our most recent refresh of the 5G market size. And we had a, roughly linear type growth trajectory, pretty standard, little slower than traditional generations. That's most partly because LTE was going to be good enough, and especially for EMBB and FWA. And 5G was going to be layered on over time. And we had a aggregate market value from 2019 to 2024 of around $84 billion. Pretty normal, a little slower than prior RAN generations, but overall very normal, nothing really to see here. That's changed since those three catalysts have entered the stage. So we had to make an adjustment to the market size, and we took into consideration government support packages that are now either have been already voted on or are in place or are being talked about. We've also layered in what CSPs are doing with their own initiatives, separate from government influence. And we kind of married those two things together. And what wound up happening is we've pulled forward the 5G deployment cycle by a few years, and it's been compressed. So basically what's happening is, if you go back in time, the 1G through 4G took roughly 7 to 10 years for the technology to be widely deployed globally. With 5G, we're going to see it in roughly 5 to 7 years. Most of the globe is going to have 5G coverage, most of the global population, well more than half. That's unprecedented. And so the curve is compressing, and we're going to see the CSPs aligning with and being the primary conduit to carry out these national 5G agendas. And it's going to be expressed in CapEx. It's going to flow through CapEx. So that's one of the ways that we're assessing and quantifying how much money are we talking about here. So let me talk a little bit about that adjustment market size. This year, so first of all, China is a big reason for this, and the government program in China. Actually, I'm going to skip to the next slide here to show this. So basically, what we did is we took that market size and we broke it down by China and rest of world. Why did we do this? The Chinese government has formal programs in place for 5G and other digital infrastructure investment, and they put numbers out in the public domain, and they've also given numbers on base station deployment counts and where they're expecting to go. Huawei has also made public comments about pacing for 5G base station deployment in China. The gist is the spend far surpasses what any other country is going to spend on 5G, and that includes the US. It far surpasses it. Essentially, the government program in China is allocating, on average, this is just this one program, is allocating on average $35 billion US dollars. I converted it from yuan, on 5G infrastructure. And a portion of that will flow into the 5G RAN, the 5G core, and the deployment, the site development type areas. Other aspects of that will also flow into things like cloud computing. It'll flow into fiber deployment and those types of things. But we scope that down to what our taxonomy of 5G is for this, for our market size. And the point is that is unprecedented, the amount of money that is being spent. And you can see this, right? If you go to the CSPs, the big three CSPs in China, and you look at their guidance for CapEx on 5G spend, those numbers, if you aggregate them up, they'll generally align with what's here. Again, we scaled it back a little bit to just focus on the 5G RAN, the 5G core, and the product attached services. They'll include some other things like transport spend, and some of the software layer that's tangential to the core 5G infrastructure. Basically, China is putting a lot of pressure on governments in the other markets. So we've seen the states looking to ramp up the pace of 5G deployments. We have the Open RAN coalition that's been formed. We have the seeding of domestic players. We have supply chain changes. We have legislation that's being put into place that is also matriculating in other countries. We're seeing it in Europe. We're seeing it in other parts of Asia. Governments are increasingly getting involved, and they're putting pressure on their domestic operators to move faster with 5G for the reasons that we talked about before. Okay, so apologies for this slide being so wordy, but I wanted to convey here with the key details of what is going on. Okay, so we talked about unprecedented government support, and we talked about individual programs that are coming into the fold. What are these programs? This is just four. This is just four programs. I have a list. there's at least 20 programs on that list in a variety of countries that are either officially underway, or they are in process of becoming official, and they're highly likely to become official. And then I'm sure there are other programs that we're not even aware of yet. But these are some of the larger ones. So the China one we talked about, in March of 2020, the CCP at their annual meetings, they said that they are allocating via a mix of national and municipal government funding. The package is around 1.4 trillion US dollars, or 10 trillion yuan, and they're going to spend that much money through 2025 on a variety of digital technologies, of which 5G is one of them. Other ones are cloud computing, edge computing, AI, machine learning. Those are some of the other technologies that they line itemed out. For the 5G portion of that spend, roughly $35 billion on average per year is going to be allocated to 5G infrastructure as part of that program. Just to give you some ideas, if I go back a slide here, on pacing, by the end of this year, the China market is on track to have over 600,000 5G base stations deployed. And based on comments Huawei has said, they're looking at a few more million base stations being deployed between the years 2021 and through 2024. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of 5G base stations that are going into that one country, gets us to those high spend numbers. So that program is already underway. The money's flowing, and that money flows. It manifests itself in different ways. There's tax subsidies, there's rebates, there's direct payments for RAN based on volume installed. There's different mechanisms that are part of that program to heavily influence and seed the market, make sure that the 5G infrastructure gets out as fast as possible. And Huawei and ZTE are receiving, as well as China Tower and CCS are receiving the vast majority of that money for the 5G portion, as well as some of the other digital infrastructure as well. South Korea, in April of 2020, the original plan was brought out. It's dubbed the New Deal. You can do a Google search and you can read all about this. The initial program was for 63 billion US dollars on new infrastructure development through 2025. A portion of that has been specifically earmarked for 5G infrastructure. And that program, they doubled that program in July of 2020. Just last month, they announced that they were doubling the size of that program to $133 billion when we convert it to US dollars. And that, again, that's going to be allocated over the next 5 years. That is that's going to manifest itself in many different ways, direct and indirect ways. And again, a portion of that will be for 5G, and then other aspects of those programs will go for other things. Other aspects of the economy will benefit from those programs as well. In the US, we talked about bridging the digital divide. The Rural Digital Opportunity Fund was announced in February of 2020. So it was a little bit before COVID became a global phenomenon, but the point is that the government's getting serious about bridging the digital divide in the US. We see similar programs in other markets coming to the forefront. In the States example, $20 billion is being allocated for rural broadband. This is the largest investment ever in the States to bridge the digital divide. This far outweighs what was spent on the CAF 1 and CAF 2 funding. Okay, this is much bigger of a package. And we believe that 5G fixed wireless access is going to be leveraged to provide last mile high-speed broadband connectivity for bridging the digital divide. I see there's a bunch of questions accruing. I'm going to take each of those at the end of the PowerPoint, so just keep adding them, and we'll take them one by one at the end. And then last but not least here, this is actually a series of programs that are in the works, if you will. We all know about countries picking sides and the swap out issue. The reality of this is this is going to cost tens of billions of dollars globally. If you just look at the countries to date that have formalized bans and swap out cadences, like the UK, for example, if you add up how much it's actually going to cost to do a full swap out, you're looking at least $10 billion for the countries that have made announcements to date. And let me unpack that number for you. In the States, estimates are running from around $1 to $2 billion to swap out kit in the tier 3 operators in this country. In the UK, some of the incumbent operators have put out numbers that if you add them up, you're looking at around $5 to $10 billion just for that one country to do the swap outs. Then if you add to that France, and then whatever happens in the rest of the EU, you're talking tens of billions of dollars that is going to need to be, that's going to have to come from somewhere to pay for this stuff, right? The telcos are not just all of a sudden going to be able to spend, all of this extra money. They don't have it. And what's happening is they're putting pressure on governments to pay for it. And I think that's what's going to wind up happening. The governments are going to wind up paying for most of, if not all of this. And we see examples of this already in the States. There's legislation in Congress to allocate up to $2 billion for swap outs in the domestic market. And then there is talk about leveraging the U.S. International and Development Finance Corporation, which has $60 billion available to allocate. And there is talk that that mechanism will be leveraged to support the swap outs in countries like Brazil. Brazil was specifically mentioned. There were other countries too, but what I want to convey here is we might see inter-country capital flows to pay for this stuff, where you have a sponsor country like the States that is actually facilitating this in international countries. And I think we're going to see that. Okay, so you add up these numbers, just these 4 examples. This is big money. Again, a portion of these are going to go to 5G, but even if you take the portion of it, you get to big market size numbers that we were showing before. And this is not just in developed markets. We're also seeing these types of programs starting to come to the fore in developing markets. Obviously, there's some more economic considerations there. Do they have the money to support these things? With fiscal policy, there's a little more challenges there. I think that's why we're going to see sponsor countries rise to the fold and potentially help out in those cases. Okay, so what does government support look like? The first thing I want to stress is that this is not new, okay? If you look at 4G and prior infrastructure development situations, government involvement has always been a factor to an extent, right? Incentivizations, subsidies, tax breaks, this is not new, not new stuff. At least those types of support mechanisms are not new. What is new is the magnitude. We're talking spend numbers that we've not seen. Again, there's no parallel here. We've not seen this before. And that is what is new. There are also some net new mechanisms that we are seeing that were not used before. One of which is direct payments for swap out, for equipment swap outs. That is a new thing. We're seeing more breadth of R&D subsidies to make sure that R&D occurs in certain borders. We're seeing spend on supply chain in a way we haven't seen before to move supply chains. We're actually seeing governments paying for some of, if not all of, the cost of migrating manufacturing facilities from one place to another. Again, there are examples of this. Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Reuters are some of the sources you can go and look at tangible examples of legislation that is moving, decisions that are being made, things that are happening behind the scenes that are in line with these types of support mechanisms. The money is being justified for different reasons. Bridging the digital divide is one big one. Again, COVID has exposed how many people don't have internet coverage or have only one option, or they don't have very good options for coverage, and the cost might be prohibitive. So we're seeing different programs to address that at a greater magnitude. Nationwide coverage, national security, that manifests in different ways, but domestic suppliers or allied suppliers, supply chain configurations, those are different ways that it manifests itself. Security vectors, that's another one. Is our systems end-to-end secured? Are there vectors for exploitation? That all falls under that umbrella. Economic competitiveness. One of the things we're seeing in the UK, they've allocated, I think it was around £100 million, and I forget the name of the program, but it was around innovating in manufacturing and looking at, basically the government is partially funding innovation for smart manufacturing, and some of the car companies that have operations in the UK are working with the domestic operators like Vodafone on those programs. So they're looking at joint innovation for 5G and how that can transform a factory. That would be one example where economic competitiveness, and there's mechanisms where the government is supporting those things. Again, not new, but the magnitude is new. And then last but not least here is public safety. So leveraging 5G for things like first responder networks, moving from Tetra GSM-based systems to next generation systems. These are important considerations that are being talked about. What is the money paying for and or subsidizing? So we are seeing examples of this going into 5G equipment. So RAN, mobile core, where the government is actually paying for a portion of the RAN. So if a base station costs, say, $30,000, we've seen examples of the government paying up to $10,000 of that cost. We've seen, so that's just one example. We've also seen tax breaks, incentives for achieving rollout targets. These are different ways that money is filtering through the system. Site development costs, so streamlining regulatory reform, permitting costs, bringing down the cost burden, and removing red tape for getting infrastructure in the field. So that falls under the site development. There's money that flows through that. Chipset manufacturing, there's legislation floating around for heavily incentivizing domestic chip production. That ties into moving supply chains. Endpoint devices, so there's subsidies for chipsets that go into the endpoint devices. Domestic production, we see that in India, where the Indian government wants smartphones produced in country. We're also seeing legislation around domestic infrastructure development, and we actually see companies like Reliance Jio and Tech Mahindra that are playing a role in being domestic suppliers of 5G infrastructure. And there's support mechanisms that float around those things that are endemic to markets such as that. R&D subsidies, and then technology trials. The UK example is what I would consider to be a tech trial, where there's government grants or low interest or no interest loans, or just direct capital payments for experimentation and innovation. So these are, what I want to convey on this slide is there's a lot of examples, and I want to stress that this is magnitude. We've never seen something like this before at these types of capital investment levels. Okay, derailment. So we painted a pretty rosy picture. We think that assuming there's no major derailments, the market should ramp and scale at the pacing that we have it on that slide. And we think that, with that said, there are some, big uncertainties that could derail or slow the pace of the market trajectory that we showed. With that said, we do think that most of these will be at least partly mitigated because the ecosystem's been preparing for these shocks. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go down this list. So COVID-19 impact, social and economic. Obviously, there's health concerns, and that changes behavioral patterns, how things happen, how infrastructure gets deployed, pace of adoption. There is some time delay there, things such as that, right? But there has been mitigation taking place there. Digital transformation, so digitalization of retail ops. In some telcos, there's been investments there. Equipping field technicians with tools where they can do more automated tasks. They don't have to spend as much time at the site. They might not even have to visit the site. These are things that are examples of mitigation to align with the new normal. Complexity of new technology. This is a big one. 5G core, cloud native, microservices-based architectures that are virtualized. This is really complicated stuff. And these systems are going to be built at web scale, and they need to be robust. They need to be resilient. They need to be cost effective. So that is an issue. Standards bodies, they are, there's complexity there too that needs to get addressed. So there's a lot of complexity to go around. We're seeing examples of homegrown 5G systems that pull from standards but might not fully align with standards. So there's some fracturing that goes on. We're seeing different examples of that, especially over the past 6 months. We're seeing more examples of that. India being an example of that. Geopolitical encumbrances, so supply chain issues. Can you get components? Where is your supply chain? Who are your suppliers? There could be encumbrances there. So if, for example, if someone's RAN doesn't comply with government mandates for where the components came from, that RAN can't be deployed. So that slows the process as companies comply. They come into alignment with new mandates. And those mandates are dynamic, right? We're seeing new things come into play almost on a weekly basis with chipsets in particular. A lot of changes going on there. Standards fracturing. So I just mentioned that with the India example. There's also the potential for two world system for 5G. That's another risk that could derail or slow the pace of 5G, where you'd essentially have two separate standards bodies that are operating separately and innovating separately instead of together. That could derail or slow the pace. Policy roadblocks, so permitting, a lot of help in areas like the States. FCC has been very proactive here, but if you look at places like Europe, not so much. There are a lot of problems there. Doesn't look like there's significant movement there, so that's a roadblock. For things like, putting out new fiber lines, where you can put 5G RAN, those types of things. Are some big problems in some countries there, still haven't been addressed. And that's slowing pace of development. That stuff needs to get figured out, and governments, they need to get progressive there as well. Supply chain logistics issues, we talked about that. Spectrum availability. So auctions have been delayed. Europe has borne the brunt of that. There's been many auction delays. Some of these are for critical mid-band spectrum that 5G is going to be foundational, deployed it on a foundational basis. And that, that could slow the pace. We're hoping that those things start to accelerate the timing of those auctions. We might see some get pulled forward and come back to a more normal timeline, but that's TBD. Resource limitations. Something I don't think people really think about much, but something that is important to consider is, can the vendors keep up with demand? This is a big problem. There's only so many base stations that can be rolled out of those factories. And when you throw in supply chain and logistical issues that reduce and component shortages, that only increases the risk of meeting deployment timelines, right? So if you have orders for, say, 1 million base stations over the course of a year, and you can only fulfill half of that number for those aforementioned reasons, that's going to stifle market development and push the curve out. We're assuming that the market can align with this, and we're basing that on some comments that have been made by some of the RAN vendors. For example, Huawei said that they will be fully ramped up by the end, I believe they said by the end of next year, where they're going to be producing, I think they said 2 million base stations, 2 million 5G base stations per year. And that to them is fully ramped up for base station manufacturing for 5G. So the other vendors have made other comments about with open source, with Open RAN, and the ability to use white box hardware, COT servers, etc., and turning RAN into more of a software consideration, that it should be much easier to scale and work around proprietary hardware constraints, right? So with traditional RAN architectures, that's an important consideration, and we do think vRAN and Open RAN has legs, and that is going to get some good traction. That should mitigate some of the issues with supply chains and things. Let me give you an example. So let's say you're deploying vRAN and you're theoretically able to use remote radio heads from any vendor, right? You can swap in and swap out anybody's hardware, right? That's theoretically what you're able to do with an open vRAN architecture. If that's the case, then that not only dramatically increases the amount of vendors you could procure from, it also enables countries to comply easier with country-specific mandates, because they have more options to go with for suppliers, right? So instead of a handful of suppliers where you're getting custom purpose-built appliances, Open vRAN makes it so that you can, it increases the scope of who you can buy from, and it eases the burden of compliance, because you have greater flexibility to compose your system in line with mandates. Okay, I hope that makes sense. If anybody has a question about what I was just talking about, just ask a question and we'll take it a little more in depth. Okay, so real quick, the last couple slides here, I want to get to questions. These are the use cases that we have identified as the key drivers for 5G. Enhanced mobile broadband and fixed wireless access. So throughput gains, how to more cost efficiently support data growth, data traffic growth on networks. 5G is a key aspect of that, as well as a 5G core. 5G core makes throughput more efficient. There is some efficiency gains from that versus an EPC. So that actually is driving some telcos to move to 5G core faster for those efficiency gains. And then fixed wireless access, that comes back to the digital divide. That is a big use case for 5G. And government funding is going to funnel right into that one. Especially when we start talking about telehealth, education, entertainment, things like that for the reshaping of societies and what kind of infrastructure you need to support the demands on the network. That's going to be a big one. When we do some of the other use cases, AR, VR, visual intelligence, remote machine control, these are use cases that are coming. Some of them have been deployed to an extent, but I think we're going to see a lot of innovation in those three in particular over the next 4 or 5 years. And we're going to see money funnel into those ones as well for a variety of reasons. And then lastly here, ecosystem maturity. Once we get to the back half of this decade, we're going to start to see more of the science fiction-y use cases become commercially ready, and we're going to see them scale. So that's coming. This infrastructure deployment blitz that we're in this phase 2 that we have here is going to lay the foundation to support those more sci-fi type use cases. Okay, so let me just do the key takeaways. We're going to open up for questions. There's a lot of questions. So 5G is coming faster than originally expected, and the governments are driving this. An increasing number of governments are getting directly and or indirectly involved in ensuring 5G widely deployed in their countries. Economic recovery packages is one key conduit to funnel funding for 5G. We've seen that in the EU with the EU recovery plan. We're seeing it in other countries as well, South Korea being another example of that. And then other countries are talking about it, but I haven't seen anything formalized yet, but it's in the works. And this money is justified on economic, national security, and public health grounds. The support mechanisms, they take many different forms and they vary by country. The government support for infrastructure and technology development is not a new thing. What is new is the magnitude. The amount of money getting plowed into this is much greater than what we've seen. It has no historical parallel that we've seen. China's leading the world by a wide margin. This is putting pressure on other countries. Europe is probably going to lag for some of the reasons we talked about before, spectrum delays, issues with economic strength and things such as that. Government involvement and economic incentives are going to stimulate the market. It's going to make the investment case more feasible for CSPs. And so basically making the business case more feasible. It's going to heavily incentivize CSPs to pull forward 5G investments and go bigger scope. And it's also going to accelerate the shift to 5G SA. That's a big one. NSA is the name of the game right now, but I've seen many roadmaps, telco roadmaps in different countries, and I've seen those roadmaps gradually get pulled forward for going to 5G core. I find that very interesting. And we expect the 5G infrastructure market to be fully ramped up in 2022. That means the factories are humming globally. That means that any encumbrances are manageable, they're mitigated, and the market is fully moving on infrastructure deployment. Okay, so we're going to open up for Q&A. So I'm going to go down the list. I'll get through as many as I can. I'm going to start from the bottom here. Can we download the PowerPoint? Yeah, the slides are available. You need to email. You can either email me or email webinars@tbri.com. to get a copy of the slides. We will be providing a replay of this webinar. I think that email will be sent to everybody, but the slides won't be. You have to ask for the slides specifically. And next question is, do you study 5G and the environment? So this is an interesting topic, especially we see socially responsible investing and company policies are increasingly being shaped by environmental impact. This is an area that we're exploring, things like carbon emissions and things like that, but we haven't published any dedicated research to that topic in terms of 5G and the environment. So the next question is, are telcos and other 5G ecosystem players exploring any unique business models to quicken the rollout of 5G? Are there any specific models showing promise globally or specific to the US, EU, and APAC? So there are infrastructure sharing models, wholesale models. We're seeing more and more of those. It defrays the capital cost. There's recent examples in Italy, and there's stuff being talked about in other countries. I think we're going to see a lot of that. We're going to see infrastructure pooling, virtualization and cloudification of the network is going to make it easier to compose resources, and the network's going to become more cloud-like in consumption and how you can pull resources from that platform. And I think that over time, we're going to see, we are going to see a lot of SaaS-based business models. We're going to see marketplaces emerge. We're going to see mechanisms that emerge that enable market players to access and consume network resources in a way that is less expensive than traditional models. Next question is, can you comment about possible CapEx reduction impacted by network sharing, consolidation, infrastructure companies? So, yeah, so this is a great question. So total telco CapEx is going to be roughly flat. And how do you reconcile that with the strong growth in 5G? What we see happening is we see an accelerated wind down of legacy and a stronger transition to 5G. So what does that mean? We see 3G's days are numbered, right? We see many examples of 3G networks tapped and fizzled off, and in both developed and developing markets. Spectrum's being repurposed for LTE. There's a thin layer for GSM to support existing subscriptions, but there is a migration over to next generation architectures, and that is happening with 5G as well, right? So an accelerated shift away from traditional architectures toward the new architecture. So if you look at global CSP CapEx, which is roughly $350 billion globally, if you look at the composition of that CapEx, you can see the fall off of the legacy and how the next generation architecture is picking up the slack within that mix. That's really what I'm stressing here. Legacy is coming off faster. The new stuff is coming out faster. Okay. Next question is, you had some data on what is in it for SPs, potential revenue for SPs. So look, the telcos need 5G. And if for no other reason that their core business is not sustainable. So they need to continue reducing cost per bit. They need to automate. They need to virtualize. They need to migrate functions into the cloud. And those things need to happen, right? Just for them to keep their heads above water and keep margins protected. So what's in it for the CSPs for 5G? That's like the fundamental underlying reason why they need 5G. When you start to look at new revenue, that's the gravy, right? So new revenue that we see that is palpable is FWA. So there is real opportunity, a multi-billion-dollar opportunity for telcos in some markets to add business for fixed wireless access. And I'll give you an example. In the States, T-Mobile, if you look at the metrics that they put out about target pop counts that they expect to get for their FWA offering, that's going to be a multi-billion-dollar net new revenue opportunity for that one company over the next three to 5 years. That's a huge net new opportunity that's coming from 5G. 5G is basically wireless fiber. It can be architected in that way if you have the right spectrum, which they do. So yeah, there is going to be revenue, and then some of the other use cases will manifest in different ways. But the biggest opportunity, the biggest justification is to evolve the core business, and then looking at big pockets of growth, things like FWA, and then AR, VR, gaming, those types of areas where there is opportunity, but the magnitude of that opportunity might not be as big as something as fixed wireless access is. Okay, next question. Do you see Open RAN as an accelerator or something that will slow down deployments? Opening up the architecture to multi-vendor requires more integration. So it does. There are non-traditional players that have strong expertise in SI and cloud models that can come into the fold and help with systems integration. So I'm specifically talking about IT systems integrator companies. ORAN and vRAN is an opportunity for them. And they have some relevant expertise to play in that space. I think complexity is going to go up, definitely, but I think that there's visibility, there's funding available for this. There is pressure on the ecosystem to get it right. You know, companies like Vodafone and Telefonica that are putting significant pressure on incumbent RAN vendors. You know, this is a lot of stories written about this pressure. And I think that there is going to be breakthroughs, and these systems will scale. I'm very positive on the long-term trajectory for Open RAN and vRAN. I think Rakuten and some of the other early adopters of that architecture are proving it out, right? They're showing that it's feasible, it works, it's scalable. There is some cost savings, needs some maturity, but that will come with time. The next question is, aside from eMBB and FWA, the rest of the use cases are probably going to be provided by over-the-top application providers. Do you agree with that? And I do agree. The reality is I see non-traditional players that are going to take an outsized portion of the opportunity. And I think that the telcos, you know, most telcos, I would say globally, are going to be connectivity centric, stay connectivity centric. They might not make the evolution into a true DSP. I think we're going to see web scale companies are going to take a disproportionate amount of the value from some of these new use cases. Just yesterday, Apple came out with some announcements about AR, VR, and how that's coming along. And I think that's there's a lot of stuff going on with AR, VR among the web scales, business models that they're working on, platforms that they're building, content partnerships that they're getting in line, looking to go OTT on the telco pipes with their own offerings for a whole range of things. It could be consumer. We're even seeing enterprise applications for AR and VR. Microsoft is working on that. And so is Google. So I think, yes, I think we're going to see other players are going to take a disproportionate amount of that new value from those investments. Next question is, when you say 5G infrastructure market will be fully ramped up in 2022, does that include the industrial IoT and URLLC enhancements and massive IoT? What that means is infrastructure going into the field. The big portion of that is just for traditional coverage. So EMBB and FWA coverage is going to take the lion's share of that spend. When you start talking about URLLC and more like smart factory type implementations, those are smaller scale infrastructure builds. The needle mover of the market size is EMBB and FWA through the forecast period we have there, with dedicated infrastructure for other use cases growing in the mix as you go further out on that forecast. The next question is, what are the surveillance opportunities for 5G? There's many. There's things like contact tracing, spatial compliance, so making sure that people are distancing appropriately in a store, for example. There'll be you'll have 5G there'll be applications and different mechanisms that can in real time track traffic patterns inside of a store that will ensure compliance. That's just one example. You could see that in factory environments, like say a car manufacturer, making sure that they're in compliance with CDC guidelines for distancing, mass compliance. You can use visual intelligence where you're using cameras with very high resolution and real-time rendering, where you can make very quick decisions. 5G can be used for that. LTE works, but it only works to an extent. When you're talking about very targeted, real-time, very low latency, high resolution type imaging, you're really going to need something like 5G to do that in the way it's going to need to be done. So yeah, there's other examples too, right? But those are some of the ones that are interesting that I think have real traction, especially in the enterprise domain. Next question is, are you seeing portfolio evolution of technology or consulting players on their 5G offerings to adapt to the changing requirements due to the factors outlined? Yeah, we are. So ITSIs are coming into 5G. They're coming into the network space. They're taking their cloud expertise, their systems integration and outsourcing expertise. They're bringing it into the network domain, and they intend to bring the network into the cloud. And some of them are extremely well equipped to do that, right? And that's a huge opportunity. This is a big opportunity, and the big players, the big well-known players, have initiatives to capitalize on those opportunities. Next question is, how do you see the U.S. State Department's Clean Network Initiative impacting 5G deployments? So this comes back to that slide we showed about swap outs and money being available for swap outs. It's going to be tens of billions if you look at what telcos have said they're going to need. So some telcos, especially in Europe, have actually given numbers. They did an assessment of their entire network, and they came up with a dollar figure and a timeline, a time frame to be in compliance, and how much it's going to cost to do the swap out in line with the government mandate. And the numbers I've seen are up to several $1 billion per telco for some of the tier ones in Europe. So if you start adding those numbers together, you get to tens of billions. So the Clean Networks Initiative, that I think we're seeing companies that are saying that they're in compliance. So just SoftBank last week made a public statement that they are in compliance and they have a quote unquote clean network. I think you're going to see other telcos that are making those types of announcements and looking at their footprints and, looking at being in compliance with some of those mandates, not just in the U.S., but also in the international markets, so that they can stay in the fold with cross-border compliance. Okay, next question is, what role do you see cloud providers playing in the transition to 5G? So a huge role, a world-changing role, and the scale is going to be massive. For those of you who haven't been on my prior web scale webinars, we think that the web scales, the leading web scales, the big ones, right? Microsoft, Amazon, Facebook, Google, Rakuten, those types of players. In some cases, they're going to own aspects of or the entirety of a network, and they're going to resemble a telco providing intelligent connectivity services to end users. We see this today, right? We see this with private edge zones where web scales are providing edge stacks on premise or at edge sites for enterprise customers, pulling in more workloads into their clouds, providing analytics platforms, intelligence platforms. We've seen Microsoft buy 5G core properties. These companies are going to need to own more of the stack to influence where things go, have control over the ecosystem that they're building, and to capitalize on and build those critical platforms that will drive the new value that's being promised in the digital era. So things like drone delivery, right? For example, right? Package delivery with drones. You need connectivity infrastructure, intelligent connectivity infrastructure, widely deployed to enable something like that. And the question then becomes, well, how do we do that in a cost-optimal way? What other considerations are there? Should we own it or lease it, the infrastructure for that? And I think increasingly what we're seeing is the web scales are opting to own more and more of the network. And I find that very interesting. And for those of you who might not have seen it, a couple weeks ago, Amazon made an announcement that Project Kuiper is a go, and they're allocating $10 billion for that. That is the first commercial last mile connectivity infrastructure deployment that Amazon has publicly announced. I would encourage people to go take a look at that. I think that's a sign of the times and how we're going to see web scales increasingly encroaching into the connectivity domain. Okay, thanks everybody. And I have a couple comments here. Hope everybody has a great day. Again, we'll be making a replay of this available. And if you want the slides, please email me. Thanks and have a great day.